Hello and welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing global issues into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Heavy fighting continues across the front lines of Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry says its forces has taken control of the village of Izmailivka in Ukraine's heavily embattled Donetsk region on Sunday, taking the lives of up to 707 Ukrainian soldiers. Meanwhile, Ukraine's armed forces said Saturday that Kyiv forces had repelled 36 Russian attacks along the Pokrovsk front line the previous day. The news comes after North Korea surprisingly sent thousands of its highly trained troops in support of Russia's military. Pundits warned that North Korean units joining the fight would stoke the almost three-year war and bring geopolitical consequences as far away as the Indo-Pacific region. For more on this, we are joined by Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by Imun Jung, Professor of International Studies at Gongju National University. Great to have you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Mr. Davis. So the Ukraine-Russian war that began in February 2022, what is the current situation on the battlefield for both countries?
Look, I think what you are seeing is a fairly or increasingly desperate situation for Ukraine, in the sense that Ukraine is facing the prospect in 2025 of either a complete shutdown of Western military assistance if you have the Trump administration come to power, or potentially a gradual slowdown in that military assistance, even under a Harris administration. And so they're facing a growing risk that that Western supply of weapons may be cut off. At the same time, the Russians are building up their forces. Their military industrial capacity is clearly much larger than Ukraine's. And now they're starting to bring external forces in. They did that originally with the Iranians in terms of supplying weapons and the North Koreans, but now we have North Korean forces on the ground joining the fight. So for Ukraine, they are facing a steady advance on the part of the Russians. They're having to fall back in the face of that advance. The risk is if the supply of munitions cuts off from the West, then Ukrainian defenses may crack and they may be forced into a rapid retreat.
Right, a very severe situation. And just like Mr. David said, the large-scale deployment of North Korean troops to support Russia is causing significant concern. Now, reports suggest that these troops are being deployed to the front lines of major battlegrounds. Professor Lim, can you tell us more about this and what impact might this have on the situation?
The situation is getting increasingly serious. Actually, North Korea's involvement in this already prolonged war, it does have huge impact physically and even psychologically too. So number one point I'd like to highlight is, of course, this war has been just prolonged, and both, as just the other panelist, Mr. Davis, explained very well, again, actually more damages was made, again, on the Russian side. So from Russia's point of view, again, that they need more manpower, and through the security cooperation agreement or framework with North Korea, they are now trying to add more, again, the infantry on the ground. And of course, we don't have really very precise information about what's going on the ground. But so far, it looks like, again, the North Korean soldiers, they are fighting in the middle of really hard battlefield, which means, again, that now these two countries, again, the Russia and DPRK, now they're going to share the experience of fighting together. This is a huge thing. If we recall our own memory, again, our own history, again, the South Korea-US, of course, this ROG-US alliance is a military alliance, and we do share several experiences of war. And that having a same experience on the battlefield, it can be really impactful for the both countries' people, and then both the two countries, again, the security cooperative framework. So, which is, from our point of view, definitely it is scary. And another point I'd like to mention is, again, now the security in the European continent is now directly and deeply intertwined with the security issues in this region, again, the East Asia, or more broadly speaking, Indo-Pacific. So now I'm very much cautiously watching how China going to be responding, because so far my understanding is I don't think China wants to see further escalation. However, China cannot be ambivalent or ambiguous until whenever they want to be. So they might need to clarify their own position too. That can make another ramification to its neighboring countries, such as, again, the South Korea or Japan, or even, again, the Taiwan. So now, again, these two regions' security issues became pretty much intertwined. Again, the psychology I briefly mentioned, all this, again, the sharing experience, through those kind of things, again, the two countries' so-called blood-tied bonding can be deeper, and it can be, again, the psychologically impactful for, again, the South Korean people, Japanese people, Taiwanese people, or even for the Chinese people, or even for the American citizens too. So again, I truly hope another world war will never happen on the world, but the situation is getting increasingly more and more serious, unfortunately.
Right. As just Professor Lim mentioned, the situation is bigger than expected, and it's a mixture of intertwined in regions. What about you, Mr. Davis? What do you think the implications of North Korean troop deployment have for regional security, and particularly in relation to South Korea and Japan?
Well, look, I think the introduction of North Korean troops into the fight is very serious. And I think that what it signifies is a growing coordination between an axis of authoritarian states, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, that are working together in a very coordinated and strategic manner to challenge liberal democracies as a system of governance at a global level. And so your other guest talked about the possibility of a world war. I think that's quite possible in these current circumstances, where you do have these four states challenging Western Europe, NATO, United States, Korea, Japan. And the risk is that if Western Europe, if the US, if states in the Indo-Pacific show lack of resolve, show weakness, then these four states will see that as an opportunity and they'll press harder. And so what you could see is the possibility that China coordinates its actions with Moscow, so that as the world is watching an escalation on the front lines in Ukraine, China makes a move in the South China Sea against the Philippines, or makes a move against Taiwan, or North Korea does something provocative against South Korea. The goal of this axis of authoritarian states is to overextend, to wear down, and to essentially weaken Western democracies' resolve to ultimately resist that, so that these authoritarian states can then make rapid gains at the expense of Western democracies. So certainly we are in a pre-war period. Are we in the early stages of a world war? Quite possibly. You are seeing, for example, a Russian sabotage campaign across NATO, directly against NATO, occurring right now. This is part of hybrid warfare, along with cyber attacks and misinformation and disinformation and espionage operations. You could see something similar being carried out by China against Taiwan. You're already seeing North Korea using threats of nuclear threats and non-traditional grey zone activities against South Korea. So I do think that we are in a very serious situation. If the Ukrainians fail, if you have a Russian victory in Ukraine, that will send a strong signal of basically a lack of Western resolve to Beijing, that would then use it to be emboldened to attack Taiwan or in the South China Sea, or it could send the same signal to Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang that could threaten South Korea. So certainly the circumstances and the stakes are very high indeed.
Right, so even if Russia takes victory, the situation wouldn't end there. We're getting concerned of more possible situations that develop. Now, Mr. Davis, some analysts suggest that the deployment of North Korean troops indicates deepening desperation on President Putin's part. What's your perspective on this?
Look, I think you can see it that way, but I don't think it's that black and white or simplistic. I think that in many respects, what it shows is a determination on the part of this axis of authoritarian states to be provocative, to act in a bold and challenging way. So I don't think it necessarily shows desperation on the part of the Russians. The Russians have got a superior military industrial capacity. They can continue to outnumber the Ukrainians in terms of weapons produced. They can continue to throw people into the battlefront, significantly greater numbers than the Ukrainians, who are facing significant recruitment and retention problems in this war. And the Russians are prepared to threaten escalation. They are prepared to rattle nuclear sabers. So I wouldn't count the Russians out in terms of being desperate. I think what actually this shows is a willingness on the part of this axis of authoritarian states to work together to undermine Western resolve and Western security. And I think in many respects, you could see this as a signal of strength. What we have to do in the West is push back against that, stand firm and deter any further actions. And I am quite worried about what's now happening both in Moldova and also in Georgia, because those could be the next steps in any fight in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Now, following the cautious stance previously taken by the U.S. and NATO regarding deployment of North Korean troops, their confirmation of this deployment has raised interest in whether Western support for Ukraine will accelerate. What are your thoughts on this, Professor Lim?
Well, I want to be more cautious about that specification because the timing is not that good. Of course, from their point of view, again, there means, again, Russia and DPRK, from their point of view, they might have cautiously calculated the timing. So for them, the timing might be good, but for us, again, if I borrow Mr. Davis's term, again, the Western liberal democracy, from our point of view, this year and especially this October is not great because we have major election in the United States and in Japan as well. Again, yesterday on Sunday, as other reporters already explained, again, in Japan too, they did have a major, again, the national scale election. And then Prime Minister Ishiba, he got lost, which is not, of course, a great news for the sitting leader. And as long as, again, the political power of the sitting leader is not powerful enough, it's difficult to, again, to consolidate all this, cooperation, international cooperations across the different countries. Again, the U.S. as well. We are waiting for, again, the election result, but this election going to be really the most competitive election in the American history. So nobody can precisely even predict the election result. So having had these kind of, again, more like, how would you say, very dynamic situations in the major countries, again, it is, again, difficult to consolidate our own power, even though we all know we need to cooperate, we need to stand up together against this kind of threat from the authoritarian regimes. However, again, it is always difficult, more difficult actually, for liberal democracies to concertate with one another. And so that is my, again, the concern. And even in Europe, European Union, they do have more than like 20 member states. Again, it is always difficult to coordinate every different country's different opinion and how to respond this kind of situation. Their view cannot be really same, which is pretty much understandable because each country has its own national interest-oriented calculation. So again, I'd like to highlight that concern among us. It is difficult to arrange or consolidate the cooperation that is concerned. So probably they might have considered this kind of thing as a positive variable for their situations.
Right. Then, Mr. Davis, what kind of support might Ukraine seek from the West in light of the North Korean troop deployment? Do you think this could lead to an expansion in the scope of weaponry provided by the U.S.?
Well, I think that firstly, if you do actually, in fact, have North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces against Ukraine, which is clearly the case, then South Korea should lift any constraints on providing military assistance in terms of weapons and munitions to Ukraine. That's the first step. Second point is that there needs to be an increase in military assistance from NATO states, from the United States, from other Indo-Pacific powers to Ukraine in terms of the sorts of munitions that Ukraine desperately needs, the long-range strike capabilities, and the critical munitions for their ground forces. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, in its last days in power, the Biden administration does need to lift the constraints on the use of US-supplied weapons to Ukraine to allow Ukraine to use those weapons to attack deep into Russia, to attack the key targets such as logistics nodes, air defense bases, troop concentrations, and command and control centers. The fact that the Biden administration has imposed these constraints and refuses to lift these constraints for fear of escalation, I think, is self-defeating, because what it does is it forces Ukraine to fight with one hand tied behind its back, and ultimately that leads to Ukrainian defeat. And then we end up in a situation where, having won in Ukraine, Russia is emboldened to attack NATO directly in a few years down the track. We end up in that wider war that Biden is trying to avoid. I think that what we need to do is lift those constraints at the same time as reimpose and strengthen deterrence signaling to Moscow to make sure that they don't get any message that somehow they can escalate their way out of this. So there's a number of steps that I think the Western states need to do, but certainly now with North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine, South Korea should certainly start shipping munitions and weapons to Ukraine as fast as possible.
Right. Now, as we speak about the deployment of North Korean troops, discussions around the deployment of Ukrainian forces have researched in some European countries. Professor Lim, what is the likelihood of this happening?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, again, the liberal democracy, basically the leaders are elected. So they are, of course, dictators. They might be susceptible or even vulnerable to the public opinion as well. But, you know, in the liberal democracy, elected leader, they have to listen to and reflect what basically their people want. So this is a, difficult part in the liberal democracy. And when they are deciding something which is crucial for the national security, absolutely any leader of democratic society, they should be very much careful. So again, for example, like South Korea's, as Mr. Davis just briefly mentioned, when we think about the option of exporting or like sending, supporting the Ukraine with the more like lethal weapons we make, that kind of option will cause a huge, again, the controversies in this society. So of course, the final decision maker might be the president, but still the lots of opposition can occur too. Likewise, again, in European countries as well. For example, France, their position cannot be the same with the Germans, their position, or Poland or Baltic countries, their concerns are because of their physical distance between themselves and then Russia. They do have more kind of, how would you say, they do have more kind of preferences and more active engagement, whereas Germany-like country will be more cautious about getting involved. Again, America, the election result will be really huge variable to determine whatever those decisions. Right. So again, for a while, we need to be just cautiously watching, I think.
Then, Professor Lim, what about for South Korea? The South Korean government has mentioned the possibility of providing offensive weapons in response to North's deployment. Is there a chance that NATO might actively seek support from the South Korean government?
So again, as I mentioned, we need to have a deep conversation, I think, between the NATO and America, definitely, and even Japan and the South Korea, our government too. Because even though we didn't want this kind of situations, ultimately, consequently, the security concerns in the European region that became our concerns too, because of the reason I just explained before. So now, even though we don't want to see any escalated situation, or we want to escape any World War III-like situations, but still the coordinated action is very much important. If we are fragmented among ourselves, if so, it will give them, again, the more strategic space to play with. So definitely, whatever decision was made in the future, my just, hope or my suggestion is deeply, we need to talk deeply and coordinated action is necessary, I will say.
Right, so further discussions and a coordinated action wouldn't make the situation get worse. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up our discussion at this point. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Lim and Mr. Davis. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.